Subcommittee will now come back to order. We thank you for your patience and understanding as we had a vote on the floor. So we'll continue. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes, and we'll go from there. According to the records, the United States government provides approximately $5 million to Venezuela annually for democracy-related assistance. What is happening with that money? Why do we give it, and how do we monitor where it goes?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. The purpose of our democracy funding is to encourage the development of civil society in order to ensure that Venezuelan democracy be as robust and inclusive as possible. We've used a number of different tactics over time. This program has been in place since 2002 and has averaged about $5 million a year. It has gone up and it has gone down. Initially, the democracy program was intended to encourage reconciliation in the wake of the 2002 coup. Over time, government-affiliated, Chavez-affiliated actors have refused to participate in these programs, which we regret, because they are intended to be ecumenical in nature and demonstrate that is open to all, politically balanced, and in support of the process rather than any particular outcome.
The details of what's going on in that program and how that money is spent, is that something you can provide to the committee in, say, 30 days? Would that be fair?
Absolutely, more than enough time.
Thank you. I'd like to yield now to the gentleman from the floor, Mr. Mack, for the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just for the committee's knowledge, my recommendation to the full committee is that that budget be zeroed out moving forward. I want to go back to kind of this sentiment that Chavez will use this kind of struggle between the United States for his own benefit. And I've been pretty consistent and on the other side of this feeling. So what we have in Hugo Chavez is a classic bully. So he tries to get people to do things based upon fear of what he might do. And I think this is an important point, that instead of looking at what it is that we're fearful that Chavez might do, we ought to look at what is the right thing to do for national security, what's the right thing to do for the people of this country, and what's the right thing to do for our friends in Latin America and around the world, not because of threats from a bully. So I hope that, I'd love to hear if you want to make comment on that, but let me just add this one other piece to that. You also talked about that we've had some great stride, or some beginnings of some strides, where there's been some extraditions from Venezuela to Colombia of some drug kingpins. But the reality is that's not due to the actions of the United States. That's due to the actions of the President of Colombia, Santos. I'll remind you of the Macled case, where we fell asleep at the switch. He was arrested on our warrant. When they arrested him, the Colombians asked if we wanted him, and we said we're not interested. And then they sent him to Venezuela. And that's why the extraditions are happening, not because of some great policy position or foreign policy by the U.S. government. If you care to react to those two statements, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the first point, I think that the reaction or potential reaction of Chavez with respect to the United States and trying to demonize the United States, with respect to Colombia, with respect to the democratic opposition in Venezuela, are all matters that one can make analysis about. They are factors. I wouldn't say that any one is necessarily the determining factor. What we're looking for is results. In the case of the Cesada sanctions, for example, there's a very specific result that we want, and the sanctions were designed in order to achieve that result. On the extraditions, actually we're getting, and I don't want to overplay this because there's much more that Venezuela could do, but just in the last since July 2010, we've gotten on the order of 10 senior narcos who were deported directly to the United States, removed from Venezuela directly to the United States.
Let me, because my time is, I'm going to go through it, because I just want to hammer this point home that Hugo Chavez, okay, I'm going to do this anyways. Hugo Chavez, well, my time is running out. So Thank you, and apparently we'll have another opportunity to speak with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I recognize the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Falamo Vega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do thank our witnesses for their testimony this morning. I just want to follow up on a couple of issues or questions that were raised, at least I would like to raise at this point. We duly recognize, gentlemen, that you're just simply following what the statute, or at least what we did in the Congress passed laws and statutes. You're just simply trying to enforce these sanctions laws, or whether it be for economic reasons or whatever. I noted with interest that earlier Chairman Shabat, the subcommittee, had asked a question about Venezuela's oil supply. And I'm just curious, for the record, what is the total dollar value of oil that we import from Venezuela, to say just last year, or say in the period of the last 5 years?
Congressman, the figure I used earlier in my testimony was, or maybe I didn't, was 900,000 to 1 million barrels per day. I would have to get back to you with a formal response and cost it out for you.
Yeah, I would think it's important that we need to know. I mean, my next question, for the record, how many sanctions do we have against Venezuela at this point in time? You know, I notice that sanctions against individuals, sanctions against companies, sanctions against officials of the government, sanctions for terrorism, sanctions on nuclear transfer, or on nonproliferation. What is the total number of sanctions that we currently have against Venezuela?
Well, we can go through them. There's not fully cooperating on counterterrorism matters, which was imposed in May 2006. Every year since 2005, they've been found to have demonstrably failed in their international counter-narcotics obligations.
Well, as I listen to your statements and everything, do I say maybe a count of 9 or 10 different sanctions that we put against Venezuela? Small, beady sanctions?
And then there are sanctions against individuals. So when you net it all out, there are a number of sanctions that have been applied to them.
Yeah, at least how many, 9 or 10? It'd be more specific, I'd appreciate it.
Some of these are broader sanctions. For example, the not fully cooperating on terrorism implies other actions. For example, a ban on the sale of defense articles, and so do you count that as a single sanction? Then that would be one sanction.
Well, here's my whole point.
Would the gentleman yield for just a quick
I'm glad to yield to.
Thank you. On the question that you asked earlier, how much are we sending? It's approximately $117 million a day.
And that includes the Citgo oil company that we have.
That is what we're sending the PDVSA,
the money that we're paying, the oil that we're getting from
$117 million a day.
You gentlemen agree to that figure, $117 million a day that we're paying Venezuela?
Well, sir, it obviously goes up and down depending on the production levels in Venezuela, the consumption levels of energy in Venezuela, and the market. As I mentioned, I'd be happy to give you a more formal reaction in writing.
So I thank the Chairman for that figure, because the point I want to make is that we're putting all these sanctions, and it's in one zap, the fact that Venezuela has this whole bunch of oil that it exports to our country, and doesn't it make our sanctions look somewhat oblivious to the idea that, so what, you put sanctions, but we're still getting your money? Does this make our sanctions law somewhat a little
if I may respond,
effective?
The sanctions we're talking about are the sanctions directed against the government in Tehran. Now, of course, they capture Venezuelan activities in Tehran, I'm sorry, in Venezuela, because they have this active economic partnership. But that's the focus of this particular sanction. So, no, I don't think it looks silly. I mean, by the same token, we've just sanctioned an Israeli company, a UK company, a Singaporean company.
I'm not trying to say that it makes it silly. My point is that the point of being effective. Have they been effective if we really wanted to do as part of our foreign policy towards Hugo Chavez's regime and all that he's done, supposedly contrary to our basic fundamental principles of democracy and all of this?
Well, sir, I'll just speak to the Iran side. We look at
No, I'm not talking about Iran. I'm talking about Venezuela.
Okay, well, we continue to provide him, obviously, with the flow of revenue. Now, if a decision is taken to somehow create another mechanism that we would want to restrict that, or if PDVSA continues to ship
But would you say that there's somewhat of a contradiction that we have here? We're putting a whole bunch of sanctions against Venezuela, and yet at the same time, we're paying Venezuela $117 million a day for its oil supply. And I'm sorry, my time's up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rivera, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Congressman Cedars alluded moments ago to the relationship or that nexus between Venezuela and Cuba. I want to try to drill down a little bit more on that. I know we're going to have another round, so if we don't get through it all, I'll continue on the next round. But for Mr. Benjamin, you are the coordinator for counterterrorism in the Department of State. How many countries are on the list, the U.S. State Department list of sponsors of state terrorism?
Currently on the list, Iran, Syria, Cuba, and Sudan.
So 4 countries. And with respect to Cuba, why is Cuba on that list?
Cuba was put on the list, I believe, in 1982 because of its support, principally for its support of various terrorist and revolutionary movements within the hemisphere. And I think it's important to underscore that that Cuba has not met the standard for rescission, which is to say that we need to be able to either certify that there's been a fundamental change in leadership and the country has ceased to support international terrorism, or that the administration can certify that Cuba has gone 6 months without support to foreign terrorist organizations and has given assurances that it will not support any international terrorism in the future. Because of its continued relationship with the FARC and the ELN, Cuba has failed to meet that standard.
So Cuba has a relationship with the FARC, the ELN, both terrorist organizations. What about ETA?
It's a good question, sir. I don't recall if there's any continued relationship with ETA, but I can get back to you and confirm that.
And what about any Middle East-based terrorist organization, Hamas, Hezbollah?
I am unaware of any fundraising activity or operational activity from either of those groups in Cuba, but I will double-check to ensure that's correct.
Is Cuba harboring any terrorists?
Cuba has over time harbored members of the FARC and the ELN, and I believe also ETA, although I don't know if they're currently doing so.
You don't know if they're currently harboring?
ETA.
ETA, but currently they are harboring FARC and ELN terrorists.
Yes, they have.
How about members of the FBI most wanted list? How many of those do we have in Cuba?
Frankly, sir, that's in the law enforcement channel, and I would have to get back to you on
well, let me refresh your memory. Does the name Janet Chusmard mean anything to you? Would you consider her a terrorist?
Sir, I'd have to get back to you. I'm not familiar enough with the case.
You're not familiar with the Chusmard case?
No, not sufficiently to give you a...
I'm going to yield for a moment to Congressman Cedars to perhaps give us a little bit of the background since this occurred in his home state.
Thank you, Congressman. There's currently a $1 million bounty on Chesimard. She was accused of shooting a state police officer point blank on the highways of New Jersey. So that's the reason the state police has put a reward of $1 million. She's been in Cuba now for a number of years. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Congressman. And I believe that was not just a random robbery against Trooper. It was politically motivated, and I think most people would consider that a terrorist act. So I hope you'll become a little more familiar with that case in particular. What about narco traffickers in Cuba?
I think some of my colleagues may have more to say on the narco trafficking issue. Mr. Whitaker?
Yes. As Ambassador Benjamin noted, there is evidence in the past of ELN and FARC members having been present in Cuba. There are continuing allegations of Cuban government involvement in narco-trafficking, but nothing that we've been able to act upon. Again, as Ambassador Benjamin noted, much of this is in law enforcement channels. I would note that we have tried to reach out to the Cuban government, and we have a Coast Guard attaché who tries to work with the Cuban government in order to identify and interdict.
Before my last few seconds, just let me say that in my next round, I want to follow up on this because it seems as though we're placing sanctions on Venezuela, which is not on the terrorist list, but more recently we're lifting sanctions on Cuba, and I'll get into that in the next round, which is on the terrorist list, and in fact is harboring a cop killer from this country. So I'll go into that in the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize, I was a little late getting back, so let me ask if you've addressed this. Yesterday, have you spoken about the Venezuelan airline Conviasa at this point? So my question is as follows. The U.S. announced that it's going to sanction Iran Air for its role in shipping sensitive technology and weapons. Conviasa routinely flies caracas to Tehran. Can you speak to the possibility of sanctioning that airline, and wouldn't it be possible as well to sanction any airline that flies in and out of Tehran if it can be linked to the shipping of sensitive technology and/or weapons?
I'll give the preliminary answer, and then my colleagues may want to follow up. As a practical matter, we do not discuss designations in public because of the possibility of tipping potential designees. Regarding the hypothetical of whether others who are involved in supporting Iranian efforts to advance their nuclear program, it is certainly within the scope of the legislation to do that, and we would certainly look hard at doing that. But again, I'll let those who deal with sanctions and the Venezuelan case specifically answer.
And before they do, Mr. Ambassador, my point here is I would very much like to tip off, that's the point, it's the purpose of the question. I would like to tip off any airline that is engaged in transporting this sort of sensitive technology and or weapons into or out of Tehran, that they would be subject to these sanctions. That's what I'm trying to confirm.
I think that is a well-known fact that that airlines and other businesses in support of that effort can be sanctioned.
Then let me just move on to the sanctions regime. Mr. Dallaire, your office commences and conducts all of the investigations of the companies that may be subject to sanctions?
Mr. Deutsch, no, we primarily work on the energy side of things.
Right.
And we work closely, of course, with Mr. Zubin on a variety of other things.
But under CISADA, with the focus on investments in the energy sector, those would be your investigations?
Correct.
How many people do you have in your office who are conducting those investigations?
At the present time, we have 4, plus support from our legal staff and the Intelligence and Research Bureau.
4 full-time employees?
Call it 3.5.
3.5 full-time employees who are responsible for conducting the investigations to determine whether a company could be subject to sanctions under CISADA.
That's correct.
I won't ask you whether that's a sufficient number, but I will ask whether you think the process, whether it will be possible to, let me do it this way. How many more investigations could be conducted at one time? How many can be conducted by one person? Let me start with that.
That's an interesting question. As it now stands, we have it divided by sectors, and I have, I think, everyone in the office doing a number of things simultaneously because various, let's face it, a lot of media reports come in the door, they have to be evaluated. We then begin checking trade press, embassies, businesses, the intelligence community. So it's a constant pushing things through a process with lots of things at different stages. So it's hard to answer that directly.
Well, let me be a little more direct.
Yeah.
For those of us who have expressed frustration that the pace of the investigations, well, it's not even the pace. We're not sure the status of some of these investigations because we're not informed until the end. But the frustration that they don't seem to be moving quickly enough, could that be addressed if you had additional investigators, if you had more than the 3.5 people who are responsible for all investigations?
I think that's a fair assessment, but let me also make 2 points in regard to that. The CISADA is a relatively new piece of legislation, even though it dates back to last July. Now, in the intervening period since then, we have set up a procedure that never existed before. We have been exceedingly careful to do due diligence on everything we've done. Hence, we probably have spent a little more time as we get used to this than would be necessary, double-checking facts.
Mr. DeLeo, I'm sorry, I only have 10 seconds left. Let me just ask one last question. If companies were required to disclose in their filings made to the SEC, those companies that trade on American stock exchanges, whether they're doing business in Iran, that would be considered credible evidence and would immediately and should immediately subject them to the possibility of sanctions, correct?
Seems like that might be so. Let me get back to you more formally.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll now start the second round by recognizing the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mack, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, could you tell us again why Cuba was put on the state sponsor of terrorism list in '82?
Cuba was put on the state sponsorship list for supporting foreign terrorist organizations engaged in activities primarily in this hemisphere, but again, for repeated acts of support of international terror.
Okay. And then in answering questions from my colleague, Mr. Rivera, you outlined some of those terrorist activities. Can you tell me what the difference is between Cuba and Venezuela?
I think it's important to underscore that the process of putting a state on the list and the process of taking another state off the list are two very different things. We have a very high bar for taking countries off the list. We want to make sure that when we put countries on the list that we're not setting such a low threshold that we will both create side effects that will undermine our efforts and our broader national security interests. As a result, one Secretary of State after another has looked very carefully at a number of different countries over the years for possible listing.
Yeah, but what I want to, you gave us a definition of why Cuba was put on the state sponsor of terrorism list, which is exactly what Chavez is doing in Venezuela. So why is it that we have Cuba as a state sponsor of terror and not Venezuela? And it goes to this point, the inconsistencies that I think another member brought up. On one hand, we have restricted visas to people in Honduras who have fought for and defended their constitution, the rule of law, their freedom, and their country. On the other hand, there are people in Venezuela who are not restricted, and they are supporting terrorist organizations. So how can Cuba, under your definition, be put on the state sponsor of terrorism list, and then Venezuela, doing the same thing, not be placed on the state sponsor of terrorism list?
First of all, I'm not conversant with the Honduran case, but let me just say, again,
take my word for it.
As I said, this is about effectiveness and about using the appropriate tools at the appropriate time to elicit the correct response.
When is the appropriate time?
I think that's a matter that we have to evaluate on the basis of the activity going on. And I would say, sir, that as we noted earlier, if the indicators are going in the right direction, it would seem not to be the right time.
You mean the indicators that are being brought about because of another country's actions, not ours?
We judge countries by the totality of their activity, and if other countries can elicit good behavior, then we certainly view that as a positive development.
Well, I just want to, real quick, if you could put up the first slide. Technical difficulties. You're familiar with that, right? If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, then it's a duck, right? Next slide. If it walks like a terrorist, talks like a terrorist, and acts like a terrorist, then it's a terrorist, and you recognize Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro, Reyes, Raul Reyes, and Ahmadinejad. We can agree with that. Next slide. Hugo Chavez, quote, "Enough of the imperialist aggression. We must tell the world, down with the U.S. empire. We have to bury imperialism this century." Isn't Hugo Chavez a sponsor of terror?
As I said before, sir, Venezuela is engaged in activities that we find unacceptable, and we are engaged in a sustained effort to get them to stop those activities. And I think that we are taking the appropriate measured approach to get them to stop those activities in a way that will produce results. We may have differences over the means to do it, but I believe that we are searching for the same goal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize Mr. Saras of New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Can you talk a little bit about the arms buildup in Venezuela? I understand that they have brought considerable amount of weapons.
That's correct, sir. The principal purchases that Venezuela has made over the course of the last several years have been from Russia, and they include high-performance jet aircraft Sukhois, which have been delivered. They include T-72 tanks, which have not been delivered, air defense systems, and notably in excess of 100,000 AKM, AK-47 rifles. So there's been a significant arms purchase program by the Venezuelan government. Some of these purchases could probably be defined as purchases to replace superannuated, old, antiquated equipment. You might, for example, say that with respect to the Sukhois. Venezuela had long been a nation which purchased U.S. jet aircraft. We sold F-16s to Venezuela in the 1980s. Those aircraft are at the end of their service life, and the Venezuelan government chose to replace them with Sukhois. So that's an example of replacing superannuated equipment. Then you have examples of new capabilities, and the T-72 tanks would be a new capability which traditionally Venezuela has not had.
Isn't there also a factory that was built in Venezuela to make AK-47s or something like that? I read somewhere.
Venezuela and Russia have signed a contract to build such a factory that would produce AKM assault rifles. That factory is not presently in operation. There's actually more that we could provide to you on this in a different setting.
The reason I asked that is because I had conversations with members of other countries, and one of the countries that I had conversations with was Panama. And they have found that Venezuela has tried to influence the people in the interior of Panama, the farmers especially. So I'm concerned that maybe some of these arms are going to find their way through different countries in South America. You have any concerns about that?
It would be a significant concern if Venezuela were to start exporting weapons of war to other nations. I think that what we've seen principally over the course of the last several years is, rather than exporting munitions and weapons and things like that, is more trying to buy influence with money. That's the tactic that the Venezuelans have engaged in principally in Central America, in the Caribbean, in Bolivia, for example. There are limits to Venezuelan largesse. Venezuela, as a matter of policy, has chosen to spread a lot of money into the population, and this has meant less money available to support these foreign activities that they would engage in.
Talking about money, how much do you think Venezuela is sending to Cuba currently?
The truth is we don't know the answer to that question. Publicly available information indicates that 50,000 barrels of oil a day go to Cuba. In addition, and that would be free or virtually free. Venezuela has agreed to re-engineer, rebuild a refinery in Cuba. That activity has not been completed. And then finally, Cuba apparently charges for the doctors and other experts that it provides who work in Venezuela, the numbers of which, I mean, they're estimates and we don't have precise figures, but the estimates are 30,000, 40,000 individuals, and there's a fee that the Cuban government charges per person to the Venezuelan government.
Gentleman, you?
Yes.
I just want to know that you wanted to know, and from Chairman Mack's statement that we buy $117 billion worth of oil a day from Cuba. By my limited knowledge
From Venezuela, you mean?
From Venezuela, I'm sorry. It's $42.7 billion worth of oil that we buy from Venezuela each year. That's my limited knowledge of mathematics, but that's not peanuts in my humble opinion. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Now that I lost my train of thought, but I just want to add that, following up on my friend Congressman Herrera, there are more than just one felon in Cuba that are currently, it's not just Chesimar. There are close to 100 that have escaped the United States and are in Cuba, basically, with sanction, with living there, enjoying the beach and everything else. Thank you. Do you have any comment about that?
All I can tell you, sir, is that actually in the past worked on Cuba, and I can tell you this is a regular topic of conversation we have with the Cubans, including with respect to Joanne Chesimard and other fugitives from U.S. justice.
I can tell you that New Jersey State Troopers are not going to ever give up the request to have Chesimard be expelled out of Cuba so she can be brought here to trial again.
And we join them in that.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Whitaker, isn't the only reason that we haven't put Venezuela on the state sponsor of terrorism list, isn't the only reason because we consume a lot of their oil? Is that fair to say?
Chairman, I would associate myself with what Ambassador Benjamin said. We are trying to engage in substantial iterative sanctions designed to accomplish different ends. And there are a number of factors that go into this process, including the economic effects we talked about, including the effects on democratic development.
So what other major economic effect is there other than oil? I mean, oil is a big one. We've cited the number several times. I mean, that is the administration's concern, right? Oh, we consume a lot of their oil. That's the only thing that's holding us back, isn't it?
Again, Mr. Chairman, I think that it's broader than that. I think that is a factor. I think that the economic relationship, broadly stated, there are dozens and dozens of U.S. companies that do business in Venezuela today, some of which are intimately involved in the oil industry, provide oil support, oil services. Some of which are international oil companies like Chevron. Some of which are like Xerox. American Airlines. And so these kinds of factors need to be taken into account as well, in addition to the effect on democratic development within Venezuela, the diplomatic outreach that our neighbors have engaged in.
Let me go to Mr. Subin there. Let's talk about all this money that does flow into. Where does that money go once it gets to? I mean, do we have any idea or sense of where these oil profits go once they get to Venezuela? Does Treasury not track that at all? I mean, we send them over $100 million a day. So what's happening with that money?
I can't speak to Venezuelan government revenue allocation. Our office focuses on.
But it does go to their government. It does go to.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Does somebody else want to address that, Mr. Whitaker?
PDVSA's receipts go directly. This is a change from the past. In the past, PDVSA operated as it was government-owned, but it operated as an independent entity with its own financial structure. One of the changes that Chavez made was to insist on PDVSA's receipts going directly to the government. And so if your assertion is that PDVSA receipts go directly to the government, I think that's accurate.
Is this, in comparison to other parts of their economy, what portion of their oil proceeds, of their their economic input, how big is that in their economy?
If you're talking about government receipts, it's about half of government receipts. If you're talking about exports, it's the lion's share of exports. I mean, a very large, I can get you the precise number, but it's in excess of 3/4 of the total receipts from exports.
Okay, very good. Yes, yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mack.
So half of the receipts to the government come from the oil that is sold here in the to the United States. Is that what you said?
Half of government receipts come from proceeds to PDVSA. Not all of PDVSA receipts come from the United States.
Okay.
The majority of exports by PDVSA go to the United States.
Right. So, you know, I think what you're hearing from us is that we want to see some sanctions that affect the oil industry in Venezuela. And let's not make it, it's not an industry, it's Chavez. Right now, all of that oil, we're funding his ability to continue to sponsor terror. And I think there's, again, I think a lot of us are wondering, and this is obviously a bipartisan issue. I mean, everybody's talking about the same thing. We want to, why aren't we putting these sanctions on PDVSA, especially when the State Department, the Secretary with the signature of her pen can allow the Keystone XL pipeline to move forward, which then we wouldn't need to buy the oil from Venezuela. And if we don't buy the oil from Venezuela, he cannot continue to sponsor terror. So what, I don't it seems pretty simple. Maybe you can explain it why it's not that simple.
I would hesitate to ever tell a congressman that it wasn't that simple, but it isn't.
Go for it.
Well, in fact, I fully appreciate your argument about alternate energy sources. And in fact, the oil sands project will probably take 10 years to come online.
Well, but we get that argument all the time. And isn't it true that there's been study after study already, all the times that the study comes back in a positive way, but then the environmentalists whip it all up again? I mean, we're going to continue to buy this oil from Chavez when we can get it from our friends in Canada.
Well, that's very true, but we have to look at the market as it stands today. And we're in a very difficult economic patch, as you well know, sir. And
You can't look at the market in just today.
Well, I'll even look at it for the next 5 years and say we've got to make adjustments, but in the meantime, we have to get that energy from somewhere.
I guess as I wrap up here, I just say that so there's a concerted effort to say we're okay with the terrorism as long as we keep the price of gas low down here. And that's the concern that I think a lot of us have. I think the administration is making a very concerted effort. We can go from half, 3/4 of their revenue to Hugo Chavez. It's okay, even though they're participating in terrorism, as long as we keep that price of gas down at 7-11. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rivera.
Thank you very much. For Mr. Subin, you are the Director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, so you are in charge of regulating the Trading with the Enemies Act. Is that correct?
Yes.
Cuba is regulated under that act?
Yes. Our sanctions against Cuba were issued pursuant to the Trading with the Enemy Act.
So Cuba is an enemy of the United States?
The title of the statute that Congress passed is the Trading with the Enemy Act, and that's our authority under which we use these sanctions.
So I would presume Cuba is considered an enemy of the United States?
That's not for me to characterize, but you're correct as to the title of the statute.
How many flights were there between Iran and Venezuela? I heard one flight a week that no longer exists. Is that correct?
What Mr. Whitaker had mentioned earlier was there had been a period of one flight a week, and we believe that's now stopped.
How many flights are there between the United States and the other countries who are on the terrorist list? Direct flights, North Korea, you said Sudan and Iran. How many direct flights a day?
I don't know, but I would be happy to look into that and get back to you.
Do you not regulate those trading with the Enemy Act? Would that not fall under your purview?
Sir, I can answer.
Yes.
There are none.
There are none. how many flights are there between the United States and our enemy, Cuba, a day?
If you're talking about
Direct flights.
private charter flights, are you talking?
Airplanes that fly between the United States and Cuba daily.
I don't know the answer to that.
Do you not regulate?
Yes, we do. And I'd be happy to get the answer for you, but I don't know it offhand.
You're the director of OFAC.
Correct.
You regulate the trading with the Enemies Act. Flights between the United States and Cuba, an enemy, are regulated by you.
Yes.
The only flights that exist, according to the enemies list, North Korea, Sudan, and Iran, is 0. Cuba is the only. You don't know how many flights?
That's right.
Okay. I'd like for you to get me that information.
I would be happy to, Congressman.
And I'd like to know not only how many flights, but who's chartering those flights, what companies own the airplanes that are chartering those flights. Are you familiar with that, who are chartering or what companies own the planes?
What I can tell you is that to operate a charter service with respect to Cuba, you need to be licensed by our office. So there's an elaborate process in which travel service providers or charter service providers need to come in. They need to make all sorts of showings as to exactly the questions you're talking about, their ownership. And
so you should be intimately familiar with these flights.
if I had a better memory, I could recite the names of all these charter companies for you offhand, but that's not something I
Would you say the number is more than 10, less than 100, more than 1,000?
As I said, Congressman, I don't know the number of flights a day going to Cuba.
Mr. Whitaker, recently I understand that there was a summary that was produced of a phone conversation you had with the Charge of Affairs of Venezuela, Angelo Rivero Santos. Are you familiar with this? Did you recently have a phone conversation?
I have spoken to him on the phone. I'm not aware of any transcript being published.
Well, I received information of it being published where you did a few things. You congratulated him on the excellent diplomatic work done on the Honduran crisis. You invited him to meet with Secretary of State Valenzuela, reassured him that Venezuela was well represented in the State Department and a desire to work together to improve relations. Does any of this sound familiar?
It does not. That is not a conversation that I had, sir.
No conversation between you and
as I said, I have spoken with Sergio Rivera on the phone.
Recently?
I would have to go back and check, but that is not, what you just said is not a conversation that I've had.
What was the tenor of that conversation?
Sir, I rarely speak with him. I did have a recent conversation. It was highly operational in nature, and I'd be happy to discuss that with you. But the factors that you just mentioned
were not part of that conversation.
Were not part of that conversation, and they're not things that I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, we will thank the witnesses for appearing here today. I would just implore you again in the future, and I would ask that the administration work with us in providing witnesses in a timely manner and providing testimony, the written statements, 48 hours in advance so that we can do our jobs as well. I appreciate your patriotism, your commitment to our country, your sacrifice and your service to the country. I hope you did find that it wasn't too painful to come before this committee, and perhaps we will have you here again. But we do appreciate your testimony here today. The committee will stand adjourned.